The grave is not an ending, it's an interval, a pause between one heartbeat and the next. For as long as we've buried our dead, we've feared they might not stay buried. That somewhere beneath the soil, a body might move, a finger might twitch, the mouth might open. Before there were monsters in stories, there were corpses in fields, bloated, red-mouthed and wrong. The living saw them and invented explanations. Not rot, not disease, something alive, something hungry. In the mountains of Romania, they called it the Strigoi. In Greece, the Vrikalakas. In the north, the Drauga. Different names for the same idea, that the dead could wake, and worse, that they could remember you. It began as superstition, a whisper, a flicker in the candlelight. But superstition has a pulse. It spread through rumor, through ritual, through fear itself, from graveyard to church, from parchment to legend. By the time it reached the page, the corpse had learned to speak. It stood upright. It wore a name, vampire. No longer the bloated peasant in a shallow grave, it became the count in the castle. Elegant, immortal, patient, a reflection of everything we envy and everything we fear. The vampire was never about the dead. It was about us, our hunger, our memory, our refusal to let go. Because the dead do not rest, and the living never stop calling their names. The vampire endures because we keep remembering, and the dead, they remember too. Before the castle, before the cape, before the cold, seductive whisper in the night, there was only the grave. And there was the fear, a fear as old as the first human who ever looked upon a corpse and felt the creeping dread that the story was not truly over. A fear that the dead do not always stay dead. A fear that they are not resting peacefully, but are merely waiting, biding their time in the cold, silent earth, consumed by a terrible and personal envy of the living. The creature we call the vampire is an invention, a modern monster assembled from the spare parts of 1,000 different nightmares. But the raw material, the primal, terrifying idea of the hungry dead is an ancient and universal one. To find the true, forgotten ancestors of Dracula, we must leave the familiar Gothic landscapes of Europe and journey back, deeper into the mists of time, to the very dawn of human civilization, to a world where the first and most terrifying of all monsters was simply the body of your own dead neighbor. Our journey begins in the hot, dusty, and unforgiving cradle of civilization itself, ancient Mesopotamia. Here, in the sun-baked lands between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians built the first cities, wrote the first laws, and created the first gods. And they were haunted by the first, and perhaps the most terrifying of all the undead. They called it the Ekimu. The Ekimu was not a creature of choice, it was a creature of neglect. It was the restless, often malevolent spirit of a person who had not been given a proper burial, a soldier left to rot on a forgotten battlefield, a traveler who had died alone in the desert, a person whose family had failed in their sacred, important duty to provide the proper ritual offerings of food and water to their dead. This was not a ghost. This was a wind, a vengeful, hungry gust of spectral energy. The cuneiform tablets, the oldest written texts in human history, are filled with grim, practical incantations and spells designed to ward off the Ekimu. It was a creature that could not rest, and so it would not let the living rest. It would slip, unseen, through the cracks in the walls of a house. It would attach itself like a parasite to a living person, and it would begin to feed. It did not drink blood, it drained life. The victim of an Ekimu would be plagued by a terrible, inexplicable wasting sickness. They would suffer from nightmares, from a constant, low-grade fever, from a profound, soul-crushing sense of despair. They were being slowly and inexorably consumed by the sheer, envious negativity of the unburied dead. The Ekimu was not just a monster, it was a supernatural disease, a spiritual contagion, and it was a terrifying through its heart, they would decapitate it, and they would burn the body to ashes, a final, purifying act of communal, terrified sanitation. But the classical world had other, more ancient, and more explicitly blood-drinking monsters. In the dark, often misogynistic corners of Roman folklore, they whispered stories of the Lamii. These were the distant, far more monstrous descendants of the tragic, child-eating queen of the Greek myths. But in the Roman imagination, they had become a species, a race of female, predatory, vampiric demons. The Lamii were shapeshifters. They would appear as beautiful, seductive women, and they would lure a young, unsuspecting man into their embrace. Then they would reveal their true, monstrous form. They would fall upon him, drink his blood, and devour his flesh. They were a perfect, terrifying fusion of the vampire and the succubus, a creature that was a walking, talking, cautionary tale about the dangers of a woman's uncontrolled and lethal sexuality. The fear of the Lamii was the fear of being consumed, literally and figuratively, by a desire that was not sanctioned by the patriarchal order of Roman society. Now, let us journey north to the cold, dark, and brutal world of the Norsemen. Here, in the frozen burial mounds that dotted the landscape, a different, far more powerful, and far more aristocratic kind of undead was said to wait. This was the Drauga. The Drauga was not a simple, hungry corpse. It was the reanimated body of a powerful Viking chieftain or warrior, a creature that retained all of its former intelligence, its pride, and its ferocious martial skill. But all of its human warmth and honor had been burned away, leaving behind only a cold, black, and malevolent core of pure, possessive rage. The Drauga would rise from its grave not to hunt for blood, but to guard the treasure that it had been buried with. It was a creature of immense, supernatural strength, capable of crushing a man's bones to powder in its icy, undead grip. It could shapeshift, often taking the form of a great, monstrous bull, or a strange, skinless creature with a foul, otherworldly stench. It could control the weather, summoning dark storms and freezing fogs to confound and to kill those who dared to approach its barrow. And it was a creature that reeked of the grave. The sagas describe the Drauga as being corpse-black, or death-pale, its body often swollen to a great size, its presence a physical and deeply foul stench of decay. The Drauga was a king in its own small and deeply and profoundly and utterly and complete understanding of the world. It is a story about the way the human mind shapes fear into a story, and then how that story, in turn, begins to shape the world. The monster on the page became, for many, more real than the monster on the hill. The ancient fears were embers glowing in the deep, dark soil of the European folk memory. The Ekimu, the Vrikalakas, the Drauga, these were the half-forgotten ghosts of a pagan past, phantoms from a world of stone and saga. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, in the remote, isolated, and profoundly superstitious villages of Eastern Europe, a new and terrible wind began to blow. A wind that would fan those ancient embers into a raging and very real inferno of fear. This was the great vampire epidemic, and it was here, in the cold, dark, and haunted lands of Romania, that the folklore would harden into a terrible and bloody fact. This was the age of the Strigoi. To understand this age, you must understand the world in which it occurred. This was a world caught in a violent and confusing collision of two different realities. It was, on its surface, a Christian world, a world of priests, of churches, of the new and supposedly absolute authority of the cross. But beneath that thin, often fragile veneer of Christianity, the old world, the pagan world, was still very much alive. It lived in the stories of the old women. It lived in the folk remedies of the village healers. It lived in the abiding belief in the power of magic, of curses, of the spirits of the land, and of the dead that would not stay dead. In the remote mountain villages of Romania, a place where the modern world was a distant and largely irrelevant rumor, this old world was not just a memory, it was an everyday reality. And the creature that stood at the very center of that reality, the creature that was the focus of their deepest and most constant of all fears, was the Strigoi. The Strigoi, as we have seen, were a complex taxonomy of the undead, but in this age, their reality became a grim and practical part of the life and the death of the village. The belief was not a metaphor, it was a diagnosis. Imagine it. You are a peasant in a small, isolated Wallachian village in the year 1730. The winter has been long and hard, food is scarce, a sickness is moving through your community. It is not a dramatic, explosive plague like the Black Death. It is a slow, quiet, personal kind of sickness. It begins with a single family. The father, a strong and healthy man, begins to complain of a profound, inexplicable exhaustion. He grows pale. He loses his appetite. He complains of terrible, suffocating nightmares, of a great, unseen weight on his chest at night. His breath smells of the grave. And then, after a few agonizing weeks, he dies. Then, his wife falls sick, with the same wasting illness. Then, his children. The sickness is spreading, but it is spreading only through the bloodline. It is a familial contagion. The local priest, with his prayers and his holy water, is powerless to stop it. The local healer, with her herbs and her poultices, is equally helpless. And so, the whispers begin. The old women of the village, their faces masks of grim, certain knowledge, begin to mutter the dreaded word. Strigoi, the first man who died, they say, the patriarch of the family, was not a good man. He was a sinner, or he was cursed, or he was the seventh son of a seventh son. He has not rested. He has returned from his grave. He has become a Strigoi mort, a dead Strigoi, and he is coming back night after night to his own home, to his own family, and he is feeding, he is drinking, not their blood, but their life force, their vitality, their will to live. He is a supernatural parasite, and he is consuming his own family from beyond the grave. This was not a fantasy. This was a diagnosis, and a diagnosis requires a treatment. The treatment for a Strigoi was a grim, terrifying communal affair. It was an act of supernatural, necessary surgery. The first step was confirmation. The village elder or the local priest, or sometimes a traveling professional vampire hunter, a dhampir, said to be the half-human son of a vampire and to have the supernatural ability to see the were true. He has been feeding. Now comes the third, most terrible step, the ritualistic killing of the already dead. there was a specific, gruesome protocol that had to be followed. First, the body had to be pinned to the earth to prevent it from ever rising again. A sharpened stake, often made from the wood of a hawthorn or an ash tree, trees believed to have sacred, protective properties, would be placed over the creature's heart. And then, with a heavy mallet or a blacksmith's hammer, the stake would be driven through the creature's chest, pinning it to the bottom of its coffin. The accounts say that as the stake pierced the heart, the corpse would let out a hideous, gurgling sigh or a high-pitched shriek, and a great torrent of dark, foul-smelling, clotted blood would erupt from the wound, drenching the men who held it down. But the stake was not always enough. To be truly certain, further, more gruesome measures had to be taken. Sometimes the head of the corpse would be cut off with a gravedigger's spade and the severed head placed between its legs, so that if it did somehow reanimate, it would be unable to find its own head in the dark. Sometimes a handful of garlic, a plant believed to have powerful apotropaic or evil-warding properties, would be stuffed into the corpse's mouth to prevent it from feeding again. Other times, the mouth would be filled with stones or even sealed shut with a brick, a grim and desperate act of supernatural dentistry. And in the most extreme cases, the only sure way to destroy the Strigoi was with fire. The corpse would be removed from its coffin, dragged to a crossroads outside the village, and there it would be dismembered, its body parts burned on a great pyre until nothing was left but ash. The ashes would then be collected, mixed with water, and given to the surviving family members to drink, a horrifying homeopathic cure to break the supernatural connection and to prevent the curse from passing down through the bloodline. This was the reality of the vampire myth before Bram Stoker. It was not a story of romance. It was a story of sanitation. It was a story of a terrified, uneducated, and superstitious people trying to make sense of a world filled with things they could not explain. The wasting sickness they attributed to the Strigoi was, in all likelihood, an outbreak of a communicable disease like tuberculosis, a disease that would spread quickly through a family, causing a pale, drawn, and seemingly drained appearance in its victims. The undecomposed bodies they found in the graves were likely just the natural results of a body buried in cold, airless soil, the bloating a normal part of the decomposition process. But to the people of that time, there was no science. There was only the evidence of their own terrified eyes. They saw a disease that seemed to spread from a single, cursed source. They saw a corpse that did not look the way a corpse was supposed to look. And they did what they had to do to protect their families, to protect their village. They dug up their dead, and they killed them again. This was the dark, fertile, and blood-soaked soil from which Stoker's Dracula would eventually grow. He would take this raw, brutal, and shambling peasant ghoul, this mindless, plague-spreading walking corpse, and he would perform a terrible and brilliant act of literary alchemy. He would strip it of its rustic horror. He would clean it up. He would dress it in the fine, aristocratic clothes of a nobleman. He would give it a brilliant, cunning, and seductive mind. And he would give it the name of a real, historical, and unimaginably cruel Wallachian prince. He would combine the ancient, primal fear of the undead, the whispers in the dark of the Strigoi and the Nosferatu, with the historical, documented terror of Vlad the Impaler. And in doing so, he would create something new, something powerful, something that would be far more terrifying and far more enduring than either of its component parts. He would create the modern vampire, a creature that had the brute physical hunger of the peasant ghoul, but the cold, calculating, and patient intelligence of a medieval warlord. He was creating a king of the dead, a king of the night, a monster who would not just haunt a single, forgotten village, but who would go on to haunt the entire world. The fear was a contagion. For centuries, the stories of the Strigoi, the Upior, the Vrikalakas had been confined to the remote, isolated, and superstitious villages of Eastern Europe and the Balkans. They were local horrors, tales whispered in languages that the great, rational, and increasingly enlightened powers of Western Europe did not speak and did not understand. The vampire was a peasant's ghost story, a crude and outlandish piece of backwoods folklore. And then, in the early years of the 18th century, the walls of that isolation came crashing down. The great empires of the West, the Austrian Habsburgs and the Venetians, began to push their borders eastward, annexing new territories, swallowing up the old haunted lands of Serbia, of Moravia, of Wallachia. As their armies and their administrators marched into these new, strange territories, they came into direct, unsettling contact with the ancient, bloody reality of the vampire. What followed was a period of a profound, bizarre cultural collision. A moment in history when the bright, rational, self-assured world of the Enlightenment was forced to confront a monster that it did not believe in, but that was, it seemed, leaving a trail of very real, very dead bodies in its wake. This was the beginning of the great European vampire hysteria. This was the age of the blood plague. It began not as a myth, but as a military report, a dry, factual, and baffling piece of official paperwork. In the year 1725, in the newly acquired Serbian village of Kiselova, a man named Peter Blagojevich died. In the 10 weeks that followed his death, a strange and terrifying sickness swept through the small community. 9 people died, all of them complaining on their deathbeds that the recently deceased Peter Blagojevich had been coming to them in their sleep, lying on top of them and throttling them, stealing their breath. The villagers, in a state of complete and utter panic, did what their ancestors had always done. They demanded that the grave of Petar Blagojevich be exhumed and that the monster be destroyed. The local Austrian administrator, a man of the Enlightenment, a man of law and of reason, was horrified. Desecrating a grave was a serious crime, but the villagers were on the verge of a riot. They threatened to abandon the entire village if their demands were not met. And so, the administrator, reluctantly and with a great sense of foreboding, agreed. He, along with the local priest, accompanied the villagers to the graveyard. He became an official and deeply uncomfortable witness to the grim folk ritual that followed. In his official report, a document that would be sent back to the authorities in Vienna and that would become one of the foundational texts of the vampire epidemic, he described what he saw. The body of Petar Blagojevich was exhumed, and it was found to be, in his words, completely intact, with fresh blood in its mouth and a foul, unexplainable odor. The terrified villagers, their fears now confirmed, immediately drove a sharpened stake through the corpse's heart, at which point, the administrator noted, a great quantity of fresh blood gushed from the ears and the mouth. The body was then burned to ashes. This single, strange, and meticulously documented report from a remote and otherwise insignificant Serbian village was the entire history of horror. He described with the cool, detached, and deeply clinical language of a surgeon the state of the exhumed corpses. He found them to be, for the most part, incorrupt. Their bodies were not decayed, their skin was intact, and their insides, their veins, and their organs were filled with fresh, liquid blood, not the clotted, dark, and decaying blood of a normal corpse. Arnold Paoli's body, in particular, was described as being perfectly preserved, with new skin and new nails having grown in the grave. When his men drove a stake through the corpse, Flückiger wrote, the creature let out a clearly audible groan, and a great quantity of blood erupted from the wound. To be certain, Flückiger and his team, following the local custom, decapitated all of the suspected vampire corpses, and they burned them to ashes. The scientific investigation had ended in a full-blown and deeply ritualistic monster slaying. Flückinger's report was a sensation. It was published, it was translated, it was read and debated in the newspapers, the journals, and the universities all across Europe. This was not a peasant folktale. This was an official, military, and medical document written by a respected army surgeon. It was, for many, the first, hard, scientific proof of the existence of vampires. The blood plague had begun. The story of the Serbian vampires exploded across the continent. The word vampire, a Serbian word that had been, until that moment, a largely unknown and deeply foreign term, now entered the languages and the nightmares of all of Europe. A wave of vampire hysteria swept through the countryside, from Prussia to Silesia to Bavaria. Every strange death, every outbreak of an unexplained disease was now being blamed on the undead, and the response was always the same: the exhumation, the staking, the decapitation, the burning. The old and largely forgotten folk rituals of the Slavic peasants were now being reenacted, with a new and deeply scientific-sounding sense of a grim and deeply necessary purpose. But what was really happening? What were these military doctors, these men of science, actually seeing in those open graves? The answer, of course, is that they were not seeing a monster. They were seeing a process that they did not and could not understand. They were seeing the normal and often very strange and very gruesome process of human decomposition, and they were misinterpreting it through the powerful and deeply distorting lens of the local folklore. The incorrupt bodies that they were finding were not supernatural. A body that is buried in a cold and largely airless grave will often decay very slowly. The bloating of the corpse is a natural result of the buildup of gases from the internal decomposition. This pressure can force the fresh, liquid blood that they were seeing up into the mouth, creating the illusion that the corpse has been feeding. The groan that was heard when the stake was driven through the heart was simply the sound of this trapped gas being violently and very audibly expelled from the lungs. The new skin and the new nails were not new at all. They were an illusion, created by the retraction of the old desiccated skin of the corpse. The doctors of the 18th century had a limited and often deeply flawed understanding of the science of forensics. And in this vacuum of knowledge, the old and very powerful story of the vampire rushed in to fill the void. They were not seeing a monster. They were seeing their own scientific ignorance, and they were giving it the face of a demon. The great vampire epidemic was not a supernatural event. It was a cultural one. It was a perfect and deeply terrifying storm, a collision of a very real and very frightening series of disease outbreaks, a profound and deeply unscientific misunderstanding of the process of death, and a powerful and deeply resonant piece of a local folklore, all of it amplified and broadcast to a terrified continent by the new and deeply powerful engine of the mass-printed word. The blood plague was not a plague of vampires. It was a plague of fear, a fear of death, a fear of the unknown, a fear of the body itself and of the strange and often very frightening things that it does after the soul has left it. And it was a fear that would, in the end, create a monster that was far more powerful and far more enduring than any of the poor, sad, and deeply misunderstood corpses that were being dragged from their graves and burned at the crossroads of a terrified and deeply and profoundly and utterly and complete understanding of the world. It is a story about the way the human mind shapes fear into a story, and then how that story, in turn, begins to shape the world. The monster on the page became, for many, more real than the monster on the hill. The monster was real. In the minds of the people, in the official reports of the military surgeons, in the terrified headlines of the European newspapers, the vampire was no longer a superstition. It was a fact, a clear and present danger. a biological and spiritual threat crawling from its grave and waging a silent, bloody war against the living. And if the monster was real, then the weapons to fight it also had to be real. What emerged from the crucible of the great vampire epidemics of the 18th century was not just a monster, it was a science. A dark, ritualistic science of supernatural defense. It was a grim, practical instruction manual, a step-by-step guide passed down in the hushed whispers of village elders and codified in the dry, clinical reports of Austrian investigators on how to contain, control, and ultimately kill the dead that do not rest. These were the rituals of the dead. They were not just acts of blind, panicked superstition. They were a form of psychological salve, a way for the living to regain some small measure of control in a world plunged into a terrifying, inexplicable chaos. They were a way of controlling what could not be understood, and they were a testament to the strange, brutal, and creative ways that the human mind will fight back against the darkness. The first and most important of all the rituals was the act of prevention. The best way to kill a vampire was to never let it be born in the first place. This was a form of supernatural quarantine, a series of grim procedures applied to the bodies of those deemed most likely to return. The belief was not that these people were evil, but that their deaths had left them in a state of spiritual imbalance, a dangerous limbo. The list of potential candidates was a tragic catalogue of human misfortune: the suicide, the unbaptized infant, the victim of a violent crime or an animal attack, the witch, the sorcerer, and even, in some regions, the person who had been the seventh son of a seventh son. Anyone who died unnaturally, or whose life had been lived outside the bounds of the community's grace, was a potential threat. Their death was not an end, it was a contamination. For these suspect dead, a normal Christian burial was not enough. It was a gamble the community could not afford to take. Extra precautions had to be taken, a dark and necessary appendix to the holy rites of the church. The body itself had to be bound. After the final prayers were said, but before the coffin lid was sealed, the corpse would be tied tightly with ropes of knotted hawthorn or consecrated thread blessed by the priest. The hands would be bound behind the back, the legs tied together at the ankles. This was a literal, symbolic act of imprisonment. It was a way of ensuring that even if the unholy spirit did try to reanimate the corpse, it would be a helpless, hog-tied thing, unable to move, unable to claw its way out of its coffin. A place of liminal, magical power, a place where the spirit of the dead would become confused and unable to find its way back to its old village home. The body would almost always be buried face down. The logic was simple and brutal. If the corpse did reanimate and try to dig its way out of the grave, it would only dig itself deeper into the cold, unforgiving embrace of the earth. These were the rituals of prevention, a grim, practical, paranoid set of supernatural insurance policies. They were a testament to a world where death was not trusted, where the finality of the grave was a comforting lie, and where a dead neighbor was, until proven otherwise, a potential threat. But sometimes the prevention failed. The monster was born, and it began its hunt. Then, a new, far more dangerous and far more terrifying set of rituals had to be performed. The rituals of the cure, the rituals of the hunt. It began with the exhumation, an act that was, in itself, a profound sacrilegious violation of both civil and religious law. But in a village gripped by the terror of a wasting sickness, of a thing that was killing their children in the night, the laws of the living became secondary to the desperate need to fight the dead. The grave would be opened, often at night, by a grim procession of villagers, their faces lit by the flickering, unsteady light of torches. The coffin would be pried apart, and if the body inside was found to be incorrupt, if it was bloated, if it was ruddy, if it had fresh blood at its mouth, if its limbs were still supple, then the diagnosis was confirmed, and the sentence was passed. The first and most iconic of all the acts of this sentencing was the staking. The stake was not just a random piece of sharpened wood. It was a specific symbolic weapon. It was almost always made from the wood of a specific, magically potent kind of tree. The hawthorn, a tree associated with the fairies and the other world, its thorns a powerful, protective symbol. Or the ash tree, the great Yggdrasil, the world tree of the Old Norse myths, a tree that was a symbol of the very structure of the cosmos itself. The wood had to be from a living thing, a thing of the earth, a thing of life. The act of the staking was a ritual in itself. It was not a simple, chaotic act of mob violence. It was a precise, methodical procedure. The stake had to be driven through the heart of the corpse. In many traditions, it had to be done with a single, powerful blow, a single, decisive act of ritualistic execution. The official Austrian reports from the 18th century describe this moment with a chilling, clinical detail. They report that as the stake pierced the heart of the bloated corpse, a great, foul-smelling torrent of dark, liquid blood would erupt from the wound, and the corpse would often let out a clearly audible groan or a terrible, high-pitched shriek as the trapped gases of decomposition were violently expelled. To the terrified villagers, this was not a natural process. It was the sound of the demon, the monster, dying its final, true death. The symbolism of the staking was layered. On a practical level, it was a way of physically pinning the restless corpse to the earth, of nailing it to the bottom of its coffin to prevent it from ever rising again. But on a spiritual level, it was an act of a profound, paradoxical magic. The stake, a piece of the living, natural world, was being driven into the heart of a creature that was a profound, unnatural violation of that world. It was an act of a magical, violent reconnection. It was a way of forcing the undead back into the natural, cyclical process of life, death, and decay. But the stake, for all its iconic power, was often not enough. For the most powerful and profoundly and utterly and complete understanding of the world, it is a story about the way the human mind shapes fear into a story, and then how that story in turn begins to shape the world. The monster on the page became, for many, more real than the monster on the hill. The vampire of the folk tradition was a creature of the earth. It was a problem of biology, a grim and messy affair of blood and bone and the strange, unsettling mechanics of bodily decay. The rituals used to combat it were practical, agricultural, almost pagan in their nature: the stake of living wood, the harvest sickle, the cleansing power of fire. But as the vampire hysteria of the 18th century continued its relentless, bloody march out of the Balkan backwards and into the very heart of enlightened Christian Europe, the monster began to undergo a profound and terrifying transformation. It was about to be claimed, co-opted, and completely redefined by a new and far more powerful authority. The church was about to go to war with the undead, and in doing so, it would reframe the vampire forever, turning it from a simple, physical monster into a creature of pure, complex, and damning spiritual corruption. For centuries, the official position of the Catholic Church on the matter of the restless dead had been one of cautious and often dismissive skepticism. The belief in ghosts, in revenants, in corpses that could rise from their graves to torment the living, was seen as a relic of a pagan, pre-Christian past. It was a superstition, a foolish and uneducated folk belief that had no place in the clean, orderly, and logical theology of the one true faith. The Church, in its grand scholastic wisdom, taught that upon death, a soul had three, and only three, possible destinations: heaven, hell, or the temporary purifying fires of purgatory. There was no room in this neat, cosmic bureaucracy for a soul to get stuck, to reanimate its own rotting corpse and to go wandering through the village at night. It was a theological impossibility. Any stories of such things, the great theologians and demonologists of the Church argued, were either the product of a simple, ignorant misinterpretation of natural events, a strange sickness, a case of premature burial, a vivid nightmare, or, and this was a far more dangerous and insidious possibility, they were a trick, a deception, a clever and malevolent illusion created by the one true and eternal enemy of God and of man, the devil. This was the great, influential theological framework that was brought to bear on the exploding vampire phenomenon of the 18th century. The creature that the terrified Serbian peasants were digging up from its grave was not, the Church Fathers insisted, the actual, reanimated body of their dead neighbor, Petar Blagojevich. It could not be. To believe so was to fall into a kind of a primitive and heretical animism. The body, they argued, was just a vessel, an empty, profane, and defiled puppet. The thing that was animating it, the thing that was giving it a semblance of a hideous, blasphemous life, the thing that was driving it to commit its terrible blood-drinking acts, was a demon. This was a profound, significant, and world-altering reimagining of the monster. The vampire was no longer a simple physical problem, a matter of a strange, unsanitary, biological anomaly. It was now a spiritual one. It was no longer a matter for the village elders and their grim, practical, folk magic rituals. It was now a matter for the church, for the priest, for the exorcist. The vampire had been officially recategorized. It had been elevated. It was no longer a piece of local folklore. It was now a piece of high theology. It was an instrument of Satan. And with this new, terrifying recategorization came a new, more powerful set of weapons, a new and holy set of rituals. The old pagan tools of the stake and the fire were not abandoned. They were too effective, too ingrained in the popular imagination to be discarded. But they were now sanctified. They were Christianized. They were absorbed into a larger, more powerful and spiritual arsenal. The crucifix, the simple, powerful symbol of Christ's sacrifice, became the ultimate shield against the undead. The vampire, as a creature of hell, a servant of the devil, could not bear to look upon the image of its own and its master's great defeat. The cross was not just a symbol, it was a weapon, a brand that would sear the flesh of the unholy. Holy water, the water that had been blessed by a priest and that was used to baptize the innocent and to cleanse the sacred spaces of the church, became a form of a spiritual acid, a liquid that would burn the vampire's corrupted flesh like a poison. And the sacred host, the communion wafer, the thing that was, in the central, most profound mystery of the Catholic faith, the literal, physical body of Christ himself, became the most powerful and most absolute of all the weapons. To the vampire, a creature that was a walking, talking, blasphemous parody of the resurrection, the body of Christ was a thing of a pure, annihilating, holy fire. The hunt for the vampire was transformed from a grim, practical act of communal sanitation into a holy war, a small, personal crusade. The vampire hunter was no longer just a terrified peasant with a shovel and a stake. He was now a soldier of God, a holy warrior, fighting on the front lines of the eternal battle against the forces of darkness. But the church did not just reframe the weapons used to fight the vampire. It reframed the very nature of the curse itself. Vampirism was no longer just a strange, unfortunate post-mortem condition. It was now a sin, a spiritual corruption, a divine punishment. The old folkloric reasons for a person becoming a vampire, the unbaptized child, the victim of an animal attack, the suicide, were now seen as signs of a spiritual weakness, of a life that had been lived or had ended outside the grace of God. The vampire was no longer just a victim of a bad death. It was the author of its own damnation. This new, theological model of the vampire reached its most complete and most influential expression in a great scholarly work that was published in 1746 by a French Benedictine monk and theologian named Dom Augustin Calmet. His book, Treatise on the Apparitions of Spirits and on Vampires or Revenants, was a massive, exhaustive compilation of all the known, historical and contemporary accounts of vampires and other restless dead. Calmet was a man of the Enlightenment. He was a scholar, a rationalist, and he approached the subject with a skeptical mind. He carefully dissected the official reports from Serbia and Moravia. He examined the scientific theories, the psychological explanations, the possibility of a premature burial. He was a man who wanted, desperately, to find a rational, non-supernatural explanation for the phenomenon, but in the end he could not. The sheer, overwhelming weight of the eyewitness testimony, of the official, documented reports, of the strange, inexplicable physical details of the cases, forced him to a single, reluctant conclusion. The vampires were real. But they were not, he argued, the reanimated bodies of the dead. That was a theological impossibility. They were, he concluded, demons. Demons who had taken on the appearance of the deceased in order to torment the living, to spread fear and despair, and to lead the faithful into the sin of desecrating the graves of their own Christian dead. The vampire was a satanic illusion, a puppet show, a complex and deeply and profoundly and utterly and complete understanding of the world. It is a story about the way the human mind shapes fear into a story, and then how that story, in turn, begins to shape the world. The monster on the page became, for many, more real than the monster on the hill. The old monster was a thing of the earth, a crude, bloated and pestilential corpse that crawled from a shallow grave in a forgotten corner of Eastern Europe. It was a creature of the village, a peasant horror, a story told in the flickering torchlight of a terrified and superstitious mob. It was a physical threat, a biological puzzle, a spiritual contagion. But it was not yet a king. It was not yet the dark, impossibly elegant aristocrat of our modern nightmares. For that transformation to occur, the vampire had to die its final, most important death. It had to die as a piece of folklore and be reborn as a piece of literature. The 18th and 19th centuries were an age of a new kind of magic, a new kind of haunting. The old, communal, oral traditions of the folktale were being replaced by a new, more intimate and more powerful form of storytelling, the printed word, the novel. And it was in the dark, imaginative, and often troubled minds of a handful of writers that the shambling, blood-gorged ghoul of the Serbian graveyard would be taken, cleaned, dressed in fine clothes, and taught to speak. The corpse was about to become a count. The first, faint and influential stirrings of this transformation came not from a novel, but from a poem. In 1797, the English poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote his strange, beautiful, and unsettling masterpiece, Christabel. The poem tells the story of a pure, innocent noblewoman, Christabel, who finds a mysterious, beautiful woman named Geraldine in the woods at night. She takes Geraldine back to her castle, an act of Christian charity, but Geraldine is not what she seems. She is a creature of a subtle, vampiric evil. She does not drink blood with her teeth, but she seems to drain the life, the purity, the very soul of Christabel with her touch, with her presence. The poem, which was never finished, was a sensation. It was a new kind of horror story. A story that was not about a brutal physical assault, but about a slow, quiet, psychological corruption. It was a story of a beautiful, seductive female predator, and it would become a powerful, influential blueprint for the female vampire to come. But the true birth of the modern, male, aristocratic vampire happened on a single, dark and stormy night in the year 1816 at the Villa Diodati on the shores of Lake Geneva. The year was known as the Year Without a Summer, a period of a strange, global, apocalyptic weather caused by the massive eruption of a volcano in Indonesia. And in that strange, cold Gothic summer, a group of the most famous, brilliant, and infamous of all the English Romantic writers gathered together. There was the great poet, Lord Byron. There was his friend and fellow poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley. There was Shelley's young lover, Mary Godwin, who would, on this same fateful trip, conceive of the story of Frankenstein. And there was Byron's personal physician, a young, ambitious man named John William Polidori. Trapped indoors by the relentless rain, the group of writers, as a way to pass the time, decided to have a competition. Each of them would write a ghost story. And it was here, in this hothouse of a creative, competitive environment, that two of our greatest modern monsters were born. Mary Shelley would write the story of the reanimated corpse of Frankenstein, and John Polidori, inspired by a fragment of a story that his famous, charismatic patient, Lord Byron, had begun and then abandoned, would write a short story called The Vampire. Polidori's story was a work of a brilliant personal act of literary revenge. The vampire of his story, Lord Ruthven, was a thinly veiled, unflattering portrait of Lord Byron himself. Ruthven was a mysterious, pale, fascinating English nobleman, a man of an irresistible, dangerous charm. He was a creature who would move through the high society of Europe, seducing and then destroying the innocent young women who fell under his spell. He was a predator, but he was a predator who hunted not in the dark forests, but in the bright, glittering ballrooms of the aristocracy. The story was a massive international success, and it was, for many, mistakenly attributed to Byron himself, a fact that only added to its sensational appeal. With the publication of The Vampire, the monster had, for the first time, been given a new, powerful costume. The stinking, bloated corpse of the Serbian peasant was gone, replaced by the pale, handsome, seductive figure of the English lord. The vampire was no longer a creature of the grave. He was a creature of the drawing room. He was a member of high society, and that made him, in many ways, even words, he had created the blueprint. But his Dracula was a ghost, a creature trapped in the ink and paper of a long, complex, and often difficult novel. The Count was a phantom of the mind. For the monster to truly become immortal, for him to truly conquer the world, he had to be given a body, he had to be given a face, he had to be given a voice. He needed to be resurrected, and the dark, magical ritual of that resurrection would take place not in a dusty crypt, but in the gaslit darkness of the London stage and the flickering, dreamlike light of the cinema. The first great challenge was one of translation. Stoker's novel is a labyrinth. It is a collage of journal entries, of letters, of newspaper clippings, a story told from a dozen different perspectives, sprawling across continents and months of time. It is a masterpiece of atmospheric dread, But it is not a simple, linear story. How do you take this sprawling, complex beast and chain it to the small, confined space of a theatrical stage? The first man to truly try was an Irish actor and playwright named Hamilton Deane. In the 1920s, he adapted Dracula for the London stage, and in order to make it work, he had to perform a brutal act of surgery on Stoker's story. He threw out the entire first act in Transylvania. He threw out the sea voyage of the Demeter. He threw out the complex chase across Europe. He confined the entire story almost exclusively to the drawing room of Dr. Seward's sanatorium. The result was a strange, stilted, and yet hugely successful play. This was not a horror story of raw, primal terror. This was a drawing room mystery with a supernatural twist. The Dracula of the stage was not a monstrous warlord. He was a strange foreign nobleman who would glide into polite English society, say a few cryptic, menacing lines, and then perform a few cheap theatrical magic tricks. He was a parlor room phantom, a creature of trapdoors and smoke bombs. But this early, creaky stage adaptation, for all its limitations, would give the world one of the most iconic and enduring pieces of the Dracula iconography, a piece that Stoker himself never described: the high-collared cape. On the stage, the actor playing Dracula needed a way to make a dramatic, seemingly supernatural exit. The solution was simple and practical. He would stand at the back of the stage, his back to the audience, and raise a great, black, high-collared cape, obscuring his head and shoulders. And in that brief moment of darkness and misdirection, he would slip through a hidden trapdoor in the stage floor. When the cape was dropped, he would be gone. It was a simple, effective piece of stage magic, and it was a stroke of accidental genius. That practical solution, that simple trick, became the single most recognizable and non-negotiable part of the vampire's wardrobe for the next century. A stage trick had just become gospel. But while the London stage was taming the monster, turning him into a polite theatrical villain, something far darker, far more primal, and far more terrifying was stirring in the fractured, traumatized landscape of post-World War I Germany. A new art form, German Expressionism, had been born from the ashes of the war, an art form that sought to express the inner psychological turmoil of a broken world. And the German filmmaker F.W. Murnau decided that he wanted to adapt Stoker's novel. There was just one problem: he couldn't get the rights. Stoker's widow, Florence, fiercely protective of her husband's legacy, refused to sell them. So Murnau, in an act of profound artistic theft, decided to make the film anyway. He simply changed the names. Count Dracula became Count Orlok, London became Wisborg, and the film was given a new, chilling, and deeply folkloric title: Nosferatu, a symphony of horror. The result was not an adaptation, it was an exhumation. Murnau had no interest in the suave, aristocratic parlor tricks of the London stage. He reached back, past Stoker, past the German propaganda, and he dug up the original, grotesque, plague-ridden corpse of the Eastern European peasant ghoul. The creature that Max Schreck plays in Nosferatu is the stuff of pure, undiluted nightmare. This is no charming nobleman. This is a walking pestilence. He is tall, skeletal, and unnaturally thin, his body a contorted, insect-like parody of the human form. His head is bald and egg-like. His ears are pointed, like a bat's. His fingers are long, spidery, and tipped with filthy, claw-like nails. And his teeth, they are not the two neat, elegant fangs of the modern vampire. They are the sharp, pointed, and deeply unsettling incisors of a rat. He does not glide. He moves with a stiff, jerky, unnatural motion, as if he is still suffering from the rigor mortis of the grave. He is a walking disease, a creature of the plague, and his very presence seems to infect and warp the world around him. Murnau uses the stark, high-contrast imagery of German Expressionism to create a world that is sick, a world that is being corrupted by Orlok's presence. The shadows are too long. The angles of the buildings are all wrong. The very film stock seems to be decaying before your eyes. Nosferatu gave the world one of the most iconic and terrifying images in the history of horror, the image of the vampire's shadow. We see Orlok's hunched, clawed shadow ascending a staircase, a silent, creeping stain of darkness that is coming for its victim. In that moment, The monster is both a physical threat and a psychological one, a creature of the body and a creature of the mind. And it was Nosferatu, not Stoker's novel, that introduced the idea that sunlight was instantly and catastrophically fatal to the vampire. In the film's climax, the vampire is tricked into staying up past the dawn, and as the first rays of the morning sun strike him, he dissolves into a puff of smoke. This single, brilliant, cinematic invention would become another absolute, non-negotiable law of the vampire mythos. The bootleg, the illegal adaptation, had now permanently altered the DNA of the monster. Florence Stoker, furious at the film's existence, sued the production company and won. The court ordered that every single copy of Nosferatu be destroyed. But a few forbidden prints survived, like a cursed and secret text, ensuring that this hideous, rat-like vision of the vampire would continue to haunt the world forever. And then Hollywood called. The American film studio Universal bought the rights to the Hamilton Dean stage play and decided to turn it into a major motion picture, one of the first of the new talkies. And for the lead role, they cast the man who had made the part famous on Broadway. A tall, mysterious, and deeply intense Hungarian actor named Bela Lugosi. If Nosferatu was a nightmare, then Todd Browning's Dracula, released in 1931, was a trance. It was a slow, deliberate, and deeply hypnotic film. And at its center was Lugosi, a man who would, for better and for worse, become the living, breathing embodiment of the Count for the next 50 years. Lugosi was not the image of Lugosi would become a staple of Hollywood horror, but by the 1950s, he had lost his bite. He had become a familiar, almost comfortable figure, a creature of black and white monster movies, often relegated to the status of a comical villain in films like Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. The world had changed. It had survived the very real horrors of a Second World War. The polite, hypnotic menace of Lugosi's Dracula no longer seemed so scary. For the monster to be terrifying again, it needed to be reborn, resurrected in a new, more modern, and far more violent form. And that resurrection would take place in a small British film studio called Hammer Films. In 1958, Hammer released The Horror of Dracula, and they unleashed a new count upon the world, played by a tall, handsome, and intensely physical actor named Christopher Lee. Hammer's great innovation was to film their gothic horrors in lurid, vibrant, and deeply shocking Technicolor. And their Dracula was a creature of this new, colorful world. He was a creature of blood, bright crimson and arterial blood. Christopher Lee's Dracula was a complete and total rejection of the Lugosi model. He was not a slow, hypnotic talker. In fact, he barely spoke at all. He was a creature of pure, animalistic, and overtly sexual violence. He was tall, he was powerful, he was athletic. He did not just hypnotize his victims, he attacked them. He would leap across rooms, his face contorted into a feral, bestial snarl. His attacks were not a gentle, seductive kiss. They were a brutal, savage assault, and for the first time, you saw the fangs. Hammer's Dracula was a creature of visceral, physical detail. The fangs were long, sharp, and canine. The blood was a thick, syrupy, and shockingly red presence, a stark contrast to the pale, white skin of his female victims' necks. This was not a subtle horror. This was a horror of the body, a horror of blood and sex. Lee's Dracula was a Victorian predator for a new, less repressed, and more bloodthirsty post-war generation. He was a beast, a beautiful, aristocratic beast. Like Lugosi before him, Lee would become synonymous with the role, playing the Count in a series of sequels for Hammer. And like Lugosi, he would grow to resent it, feeling that the character had become a one-dimensional, roaring monster. In his later films, he would often refuse to speak any of the lines he was given, performing the role in complete, menacing silence, communicating purely through his towering physical presence and his rage-filled eyes. And so, the monster evolved again. He had been a stage magician. He had been a walking plague rat. He had been a hypnotic, foreign aristocrat. And now he was a brutal sexual beast. For the rest of the 20th century, these would be the dominant models for the vampire. But in the modern era, the monster has become so famous, so deeply ingrained in our culture, that he can now be deconstructed, re-examined, and reborn in 1,000 different forms. In 1992, the director Francis Ford Coppola went back to the source, creating his lush, operatic, and deeply strange film, Bram Stoker's Dracula. For the first time, a major film attempted to capture the bizarre, fever dream quality of Stoker's original novel. His Dracula, played with a strange, tragic weariness by Gary Oldman, was a shapeshifter of incredible power, transforming into a wolfman, a swarm of rats, a strange green mist. But Coppola's great innovation was to give the monster a new motivation, a motivation that Stoker never intended: love. His Dracula was not a simple monster. He was a tragic, romantic anti-hero. He was the historical Vlad, a noble warrior who had renounced God after the tragic death of his beloved wife, and who had been cursed to walk the earth for centuries as an undead creature, searching for the reincarnation of his lost love. For the first time, the audience was asked not just to fear the monster, but to pity him, to understand him, to even, perhaps, root for him. The predator had become a romantic hero. This final, profound evolution has opened the floodgates. The vampire is no longer one thing. He is everything. He is the powerful, philosophical, and deeply tragic figure of the Castlevania animated series. He is the angst-ridden, bisexual, and deeply human rock star of Anne Rice's novels. He is the action hero of the Blade and Underworld films. He is the sparkling, romantic teenager of Twilight. The creature has been resurrected so many times that he has become a permanent and endlessly adaptable part of our culture. He has been a stage magician, a plague rat, an aristocrat, a beast, and a tragic lover. He changes his face to reflect the fears and the desires of every new generation. He is a mirror, a dark and often bloody mirror. The reason he is immortal on the screen is because the story he tells is the immortal story of our own relationship with death, with desire, and with the monster that lives and sometimes loves inside all of us. The monster, it seemed, was real. For centuries it had walked the earth, leaving a trail of bloodless corpses, of open graves, of a fear so profound it could bring entire villages to a standstill. It was a creature of the night, a being of supernatural power, a servant of the devil. It was a vampire. The story was a powerful one, a satisfying one. And in the bright, new, self-assured age of reason and enlightenment, it was a story that had to be killed. The hunt for the vampire in the 18th and 19th centuries was not just a physical one, waged with stakes and fire in the graveyards of Eastern Europe. It was also an intellectual one. a war of ideas waged in the quiet, candlelit laboratories and the dusty, book-filled libraries of the great Western universities. The scientists, the doctors, the philosophers of the age, the men who had dismantled the old superstitious world and replaced it with a new, beautifully rational clockwork universe, could not and would not abide the existence of a creature as chaotic, messy, and irrational as the vampire. And so they began their own, far more meticulous and far more lethal kind of an exhumation. They began the autopsy of the myth itself. Their goal was simple: to find the real monster. To find the mundane, biological or psychological truth that was hiding behind the supernatural mask of the vampire. It was a process of a reverse alchemy, an attempt to turn the dark, magical gold of the folklore back into the simple, boring lead of the natural world. The first and most obvious place to start was with the body, the strange, unsettling, incorrupt corpse that the vampire hunters were so consistently finding in the graves. The scientists, reading the lurid, unscientific reports of the military surgeons like Flückiger, saw not a monster, but a profound and tragic ignorance of the process of human decomposition. The bloated body of the vampire, they argued, was not a sign of a supernatural feeding. It was the natural result of the buildup of gases produced by the bacteria in the gut. The ruddy, healthy-looking skin was a result of the pooling of the blood, from them, and the disease was highly contagious, spreading easily through the close, unsanitary confines of a peasant family's home. It would often claim an entire family, one by one, creating the illusion of a supernatural and deeply personal curse. A family was not being hunted by their own undead father. They were being killed by the same bacterial infection that had killed him. Other diseases were also proposed as the real vampire. There was porphyria, a rare genetic blood disorder whose symptoms can include a severe photosensitivity, a fear of sunlight, a reddish discoloration of the teeth, and a facial disfigurement that could, in its most extreme forms, give a person a monstrous, almost bestial appearance. And then there was rabies. The connection here was an obvious one. Rabies was a disease that was passed on through a bite. It had a long incubation period. And in its final, furious stage, it would transform a normal, rational human being into an aggressive, hypersexual, and deeply violent creature. A person who would bite, who would foam at the mouth, who was, for all intents and purposes, a monster. And finally, there was the simple and deeply tragic explanation of premature burial. In an age before modern medicine, before the invention of the stethoscope, of the EKG, The diagnosis of death was often a deeply inexact science. A person who was in a deep coma or a cataleptic trance could very easily be mistaken for dead. They would be buried, and then, a few days later, they would wake up. Imagine the horror. You wake up in a small, dark, and completely enclosed space. You are in your own coffin. You scream, you claw at the lid, you fight with the last of your strength to escape your own premature grave. And if you succeeded, if you managed to claw your way back to the surface, you would emerge, not as a person, but as a thing, a terrifying and deeply traumatized figure, covered in the dirt of the grave, your fingernails torn and bloody, your mind shattered by the ordeal. You would be, in the eyes of the terrified villagers who saw you, a revenant, a corpse that had returned from the dead. The science was a powerful and deeply convincing monster slayer. It had taken every single supernatural element of the vampire myth, and it had found a plausible, rational, and deeply natural explanation for it. The monster, it seemed, was dead. It had been killed not by a stake, but by a theory. And yet, the myth refused to die. The scientific explanations were elegant. They were logical. They were, in many cases, almost certainly correct. But they were also unsatisfying. They could explain the individual pieces of the puzzle, but they could not and did not explain the strange and deeply powerful way that those pieces had all come together to form a single, coherent, and universally terrifying monster. Science could explain why a corpse might look strange. It could explain why a disease might spread through a family. It could explain why a person might be buried alive. But it could not explain why a terrified and deeply uneducated peasant in a remote Serbian village, who had no knowledge of any of these scientific principles, would look at these disparate and seemingly unconnected events and would say, with an absolute and an unshakable certainty, vampire. The science could not explain the story, and it is the story, in the end, that is the true and most unkillable of all the monsters. The vampire myth was not just a simple and deeply ignorant misinterpretation of the natural world. It was a work of a collective and deeply creative genius. It was a story that a culture had told itself for thousands of years to make sense of its deepest and most profound of all anxieties. The anxiety of death, the anxiety of disease, the anxiety of the body, and of its strange and often very frightening and very messy processes. And the deep and often very personal and very human anxiety of what happens to the people we love after they are gone. The scientific explanation for the vampire is, in its own way, a far more terrifying and far more hopeless story than the myth itself. The scientific explanation tells us that the universe is a random and deeply indifferent place. That disease is just a matter of a microscopic and deeply meaningless biological process. That death is just a simple and deeply final cessation of a biochemical function. But the vampire myth, for all its horror, tells us something else. It tells us that the universe is not indifferent, that it is a place of a deep and often very terrifying and very personal form of a meaning. It tells us that death is not the end of the story. It tells us that the people we have lost are not truly gone, they are still here. And that they can still, in a very real and very powerful and sometimes very terrifying way, affect our lives. The science can explain the corpse, but it cannot explain the ghost. It can explain the sickness, but it cannot explain the curse. It can explain the biology of the monster, but it cannot, and it never will be able to, explain why the myth of that monster refuses so stubbornly and so beautifully and so terrifyingly to die. And that is the final and most profound of all the paradoxes. The scientists of the Enlightenment, in their brave and deeply rational attempt to kill the vampire, had, in fact, done the very opposite. By studying it, by writing about it, by debating it, by trying to explain it away, they had inadvertently given it a new and far more powerful and far more enduring kind of a life. They had taken a crude and deeply provincial peasant superstition, and they had introduced it to the great and deeply sophisticated drawing rooms of all of Europe. They had killed the monster. And in doing so, they had turned it into a legend. And a legend, as we all know, is a thing that can never, ever truly die. The vampire survived the grave, the stake, the sermon, and the page. It was never destroyed, only adapted, and as the world changed, so did its reflection. When the 20th century began, faith was fading and science had replaced the sacred. But fear never needed God. It only needed darkness. And into that darkness stepped a new creature, born not from superstition, but from the camera. In 1922, audiences saw Nosferatu for the first time, a silent film that felt anything but silent. The Count was no longer a bloated corpse from folklore, nor an elegant noble from literature. He was skeletal, rodent-faced, insectile, the plague personified. He did not seduce, he infected. In the flickering light of the projector, the vampire became a shadow that moved by its own will. And in that shadow, the world saw itself, hungry, industrial, faceless. A decade later, Dracula spoke. Bela Lugosi's voice was slow, deliberate, and hypnotic, an accent from nowhere, belonging to no living man. Where Nosferatu had been disease, Dracula was desire. He wore evening clothes and moved through high society. What would you give to never age? What would you trade to never be forgotten? At what point does hunger become identity? By the time twilight arrived, the crucifix was irrelevant. The vampire no longer represented death. It represented choice. Eternal life as lifestyle, immortality as romance. The monster had become a mirror, and audiences didn't recoil. They leaned closer. We no longer feared the vampire. We wanted to be it. But the myth never truly loses its teeth. In every glittering version, there's still the shadow behind it. The reminder that eternity is not mercy, but punishment. To live forever is to watch the world rot around you, to feed endlessly without satisfaction, to become history's ghost wandering through the present tense. That's why the vampire endures. It's the perfect myth for a world that can't stop moving, can't stop consuming, and can't stand the thought of ending. The peasant's corpse has become the influencer's face. The hunger has simply changed form, from blood to attention, from vitality to relevance. And beneath the algorithms and screens, the old story still breathes. The dead still want to be remembered. The living still want to be eternal. In a way, the vampire was prophecy. It predicted the age when everyone would live in the dark and feed on each other's reflection. A world where immortality isn't granted by magic, but by memory. A world where we never stop watching and never stop hungering. The vampire no longer sleeps in coffins. It sleeps inside cameras, stories, timelines, digital crypts that never decay. It drinks from us, and through us, we keep it alive. Because the myth only dies when we stop telling it. And we haven't stopped. We never will.